Okay. We're going to try it again. We've done this a couple times, but you guys have not seen that yet. Okay. I'm going to burn through a lot really fast in my attempts at recording this so far. I have spoken for way too long about a lot. So, um, today I'm going to be talking about Birth of a Nation. It is a film from 1915 that was directed by D.W. Griffith and based on the book and play by Thomas Dixon. Um, some things first to keep in mind about movies at the time. A lot of people got news from their cinema at the time, so one of the major reasons people would go to the movies wasn't just to see a movie or to be entertained. It was to get news about the war. 1915, again, is 1 year after the start of the First World War, and different things like that. So I think it's important to remember that the things and ideas that were expressed to people in that space were sort of put hand in hand with the concepts of news and sort of fact versus fiction. There were a lot of really weird sort of lines drawn and blurred for people at the time. Another thing to keep in mind is Hollywood itself is only about 8 years old here. So there was really nothing set in stone in terms of the way things were presented or how people were supposed to interpret what was presented to them. There just wasn't a lot of time, I guess, for people to have access to film as a media, and they didn't really know necessarily what to take from it or what everything meant. There was not necessarily a social consensus on everything that was presented to everybody. And then to remember that all movies at this point are completely silent. A lot of times they had various tracks and songs that would play along with them, or recordings, or they would have an orchestra that would come in and play if it was a nicer theater in different places of the country. But like, it's important to remember that the movies are silent. It is a lot of just like images, moving images presented then with descriptions of the characters you're seeing, followed by whatever the director wanted you to know about that section. D.W. Griffith's presentation was very sort of poetic in things, and they openly spoke about what they wanted from each scene and what things meant. There was not a lot of subtlety, I guess, in the way that they portrayed what they were portraying. I think that's important when you look at like the way that they talk about their movie post its release, how they speak openly about not wanting to offend African American people, and it's not really about that, but it's just fascinating because if we watch it now from a modern sentiment, it is palpable, the racism that is incorporated in this film. I personally have taken a couple different classes on film history that have talked about this movie just from its technical advances and just from its racist effect on America and the problems that it did. So a brief history of the plot, which isn't super important, but it's also really long. The movie's about 3 hours long. But the movie follows two families. So the movie follows the story of pre-Civil War through the Civil War into the Reconstruction era. And that's like the story that they're trying to tell. This movie came out in 1915 and the Civil War ended in 1865. So it's only been about 47 years since the end of the Civil War. So most of the people that fought in the Civil War and survived, a lot of them are still alive. People fought in the wars younger back then, and it just was not that long after. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind about the state of 1915 at the time. So the movie is about two families. You've got the northern Stonemans and the southern Camerons. And basically there's a romance between a son of the South and a daughter of the North. They are in love but can't be together because the Civil War starts. They all go to war. Everything is really exciting and terrifying. I'll stay here. One of the very first things that this movie pioneered in a lot of different ways is it's one of the first sort of like sensationalized war movie. It is known for pioneering its techniques in like making 100 extras look and feel like 1,000 extras. The battles in this scene are extravagant beyond anything people at the time had seen, especially in film. It is over the top in a lot of different regards, and people really were like blown away by a lot of things. I think this goes to talk sort of why it got big, but I'll talk about that later. Back to the plot. So the first act is all about the Civil War. It's before the Civil War. You've got black people on slaves on plantations, living their lives. They're all happy, and then the Civil War starts. Abraham Lincoln is portrayed as sort of a sentimental character who was forced to start the Civil War by his cabinet, and that's like it's a really weird stance that they take. But they're not anti Abraham Lincoln; they're just against the fact that we had a Civil War 50 years out. And so you've got the war happens. There are a lot of scenes of like the Northern Union Army, which is made of a lot of black people attacking Southern families and being cruel and awful, but the Confederacy is just this ragtag group of people who come in and like save the day. That is a huge theme throughout the movie. That like the Confederacy are people who were just living their lives and they were attacked, and they were like, you know, brought on by these people who they were all content until this war started, and they had happy lives on the farms and things like that. That's like a big aspect of how they portray the Civil War in the first act, and then it sort of doubles down. And then Act 2, you've got it's the same two families again that they just sort of represent what's going on in both. So the Stonemans like move to the South in Act 2 to like see and be a part of the Reconstruction era, but they bring like bad black people with them. The start of Act 2 is there's a voting section where black people are getting to vote for the first time, but it's seen as like black people like hoarding to the polls and then scaring white people away from voting, and then that leads to it's absurd. This movie is absolutely absurd, but it leads to like an all black Congress that's made, and then they like do all this evil stuff, and they're portrayed as these like really lazy Congress people who are being really inappropriate with their shoes off, feet on tables, they're eating chicken and drinking beer, they're all kinds of these, they just portray them as these horrible monsters. And then in all of that, they also, so you've got there's the daughter of the Northern family, she's pursued by a black man, and the daughter of the Southern family is pursued by a black man, and both of them end up the Southern woman, she at one point is like pursued literally into the woods and then jumps off a cliff to save herself from being like married by a black man. I think that's one of the interesting things about it is that like we know that it's rape now, but like the way they talk about it and what's like going on is they're like, oh, marry me, and then she goes no, and then runs. It's really like it's just like the concepts and the links between marriage and honestly like rape in a lot of ways in this movie is really bad. But it, and then too, Eliza as well is like kidnapped at one point, or not Eliza, that's Tom's cabin. Nope. Her name's Elsie. She's like kidnapped and taken by a black man who like worked for her father and all these things. And then this is sort of one of the most famous parts about the movie is Act 2. The Southern people rebuild the KKK, and they come in and they squell all the black people, and they keep them down, and they get them under control because they're being awful, and they come in and they save the day, and they save the white woman from being raped by the black person. And it's interesting because at the end of the movie there's it's like it shows images of white people getting to vote again, and the KKK standing there outside the voting booths and making sure that the white person gets the chance to vote, which I think is a really interesting image that comes up later. So that's the plot of the movie. Now, some other important backstory and history on it, where the story takes place in both the South and the North during and after the Civil War. When it's, the Civil War, and then 47, sorry, I sort of went off my notes and now I'm catching back up. So this is, I guess, sort of the other side of Birth of a Nation. So you've got, it really is split into two categories. There is the fact that it is an incredibly racist film, just abhorrently racist, absolute garbage. And also, though, it is one of the first movies, I think, that even from a modern standpoint, even today, if you watch other movies from that same year, you'll go, that one was a lot more entertaining than all of the rest of them. And that's for a couple different reasons. So Birth of the Nation is, I'll start with one, it is 3 hours long. So that's a little long for our standpoint, but there are plenty of movies that come out even now that are 3 hours. The Irishman came out last year. It's like 3.5 hours long. All kinds of movies. The Joker's like 2.5 hours long. So it is sort of the first movie that really like gives sort of the length to which I guess movies are for a while after that, and big epics and these sweeping ideas and splitting them into two and intermissions. It pioneers sort of the length of it. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which came out in 1914, is only 46 minutes long, and they're both based on very popular books. And Uncle Tom's Cabin, we've talked about, was a huge thing at the time, and it permeated throughout all of this as well. But like this movie just swept in all kinds of different ways. It was something to go do for that amount of time, especially in this sort of troubling time in America. It was also, I think this is actually really interesting, it was the first movie to be fully scored. Joseph Brel, I think it's Brel. He wrote an entire score for the film where he wrote original music. He wrote compositions of old songs that people would recognize from the Civil War era, but he also wrote songs that were very popular at the time and put them into the movie. All of this was just to make things better. The movie was also, I mentioned earlier, the sort of grandiosity of the film and what it can do and what it was, is really in terms of Hollywood and its giant, over the top, this is what a movie's supposed to look like. Birth of the Nation is the first major spectacle film. The war scenes in the movie, even today, if you understand sort of a little bit about film history and you can respect what they did and how they did what they did, it's very hard to not be sort of taken aback, except they also at the end of the movie use those same techniques to portray the KKK in an amazing light, and it's a lot of back and forth. The movie popularized close-ups. It did all kinds of things for film editing and what they showed in different ways, cross-cutting, all kinds of things that weren't necessarily firsts, but come together to tell a 3-hour-long cohesive story, which is very, very intense in a lot of different ways. So let me find some more. There's a quote. I'm going to read my quote. Oh no, should I just... So Birth of a Nation, in terms of its... Oh no, oh no, oh no. No. I know this is more than 12 minutes. I'm so sorry. But I had to hold a lot and pause because I'm disorganized. How did Tom reconstruct American identity? Right. Okay. So in terms of identity, I think this movie is one of the first times, especially post-Civil War, that somebody made something that very publicly and very outspokenly sort of gave a stance on how white people felt about black people in America after the Civil War. This is a very critical time in America. A lot of people are going, war is evident in a lot of different places, and it's around this time, and this movie is just so massive in a lot of different ways. The aspects of it that are a lot of firsts for film create a space where everybody had to go see the movie. It was the sense in Hollywood and in America that wow, they did an amazing thing. You've got to go see it. I think Roger Ebert is the one who says this movie is incredible in a lot of different ways. The problem is that it argues for evil, which I think is a brilliant way to sum it up. That a lot of people had to go see the movie because it was deemed this incredible experience to go do. So whether you believed it or not, you saw it. And then when that happened, it created a space for people to openly speak about their resentment towards African Americans in the time. And the movie is literally known for the reason the KKK came back in such prominence in America from 1915 all the way through the Civil Rights Movement, which is another 50 friggin' years afterwards. And all these things and how they still permeate around today. It's just things like that I think are important to remember, that it's just this movie in a lot of different ways, told a lot of people that it was okay for them to think the way that they were thinking and do the things that they wanted to do, despite the fact that the NCAA or the NAACP fought really hard to get rid of this movie and fought really hard to say, like, these are dangerous ideas you're dealing with, and you're portraying our people in a way that isn't fair at all and isn't right, even at the time. But it didn't stop the film from resonating with sort of an underlying, maybe not even that underlying, but not necessarily openly discussed in terms of media and art and culture at the time. It was also really popular in Britain, which is an interesting thing that I read, that France canceled it after a couple years, but that was like 10 years after it came out here. But around the same time, it made its way to Britain, and a lot of people watched it and saw it, and it resonated with sort of the colonial concepts that were going on in Britain, and the empirical aspects and ideals that they held for themselves at the time. It recognized sort of the othering involved. And then the film reflects a lot of social norms of the time. Women are prizes to be won. They are only ever attacked. There's a weird amount of sort of sentimentality to it that I guess still resonates today, but ultimately it's just this melodramatic story that puts black people as black people in the worst spot, and white people wearing white robes coming in and saving them. That was the intent behind their movie. They state it outwardly in like the first thing. The first like title slide is about how they feel like the war was bad, and that everything was fine beforehand, and they don't understand really what was going on. It's a really interesting movie. I don't recommend it unless you really, really, really want to know what the first like war battle scene in America, in Hollywood, looked like, or if you are really interested to know what the first score happened. It's also the first theme song, which I read. Like, the first like considered theme song is from that movie. So that's a lot about it. I'm kind of going over time, so I'm going to wrap it up really quick. If you have any questions, like, post them in the comments, and I can definitely talk some more about it. There's just a ton about this movie, which is kind of problematic on its own, considering what it's about. But there are just so many things that are important. So I'll finish with one other thing that I think it's important to know, that the movie, in terms of its popularity in the country itself, didn't last long. It has become a very historic, very prominent sort of feature and pivotal, but like all of the great technical advances that it did, people picked them up immediately and made better things. I think that was one sentiment that I read that I really appreciated, that people just got better about it after. Anyway, thanks for listening. I know it went a little long. You can watch it at double time, I think, here if you click on that. That's how I watch all my movies. So sorry it's long. Oops. Stay safe, guys. I miss class. Yep.